Good morning. Hemshech Beis, volume 2. We're at the bottom of page 1182, Aleph Kuf Pei Beis. If everybody can mute, because if you don't mind. Okay. So this paragraph on page 1182 we began after explaining V'yadaita Hayoim Ki Hashem Hu Elikim, the Yediyah, V'yadaita, Das Elyon and Das Tachten, Hashem Elikim, the unity between the divine that's beyond existence and divine within existence, two ways, either through Das Tachten or Das Elyon, and Das Elyon itself we learned a deeper level as well, a third level. So now he's focusing on the word Shamayim b'Shamayim mimal v'ala oretz mitachas, which is, what exactly does that add? Why do we need both phrases? Because both were created by Shem Elikim, so they're part of existence. So once you say one is filled with the knowledge of Havayu Elikim, then the other also goes along with it. So why the need to emphasize these two states, these two domains called Shemayim Mimal, heaven above, and Oretz Mitachas, and the earth below? Okay. So with that, he began that Al Pi Pashut Yesh Leimer, that the basic and most obvious answer is as follows. It's in order to preempt or negate the opinion or the argument of the non-believers, the minim, the apikursim, who want to separate and create a duality. They say shtei reshuyos, that it's shtei reshuyos, which means that there are two domains, one heaven and one on earth. Can everybody mute themselves because there's sound coming from somewhere? Okay. Like the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, the Amgeshi, the sorcerer who said to the scholar, to the sage, to the Ameimar, the Amoira, that the Palgal Chale'ela, from the top half belongs the Hurmiz. Hurmiz was one leader, king, and Palgal Chalatata, meaning from the second half, is another king. So it's two different domains. Which was the expression that you'll find sometimes, the argument Ozav Hashem Esa Oretz, meaning that God created heaven and earth, but then he left earth and gave it to the control of the mazolas, the stars, the constellations. But God is in heaven and does not govern the events on this world, which of course is from a Torah point of view is kfirah. That is heresy. So the pasuk is coming to negate that by saying b'shamayim mimal oretz mitachas. V'yadaita hayim ki Hashem Hu Elikim is both the shamayim mimal and oretz mitachas. It's all pervasive by one unity. There's levels in the unity, Das Elyon and Das Tachten, but it's all one God that is everywhere. Like he says at the end, Einaid. But so that's what he's adding by saying shamayim mimal oretz mitachas. Then the Rebbe Rashab went to explain it in a more ruchnistic way. What would be the argument? The argument would be that Gashmius and Ruchnius, no, Shemayim symbolizes everything that's spiritual. Ha'aretz symbolizes the material. Mitzvahs Maisius, things that are involved, that engage and are involved in this material world. So the argument could be made, you want to find God, you find God in spirituality, in Ruchnius, in Aveda Ruchnius, like he says, the Ovis. But mitzvahs maisius is seemingly like almost trivial and inferior to the divine. That would be the argument. Like he says, Loma yemer hagoyim ayeh no elekechem. Why should the Goyim say, where's your God? What's their havamina? Because by them, God is not on earth, is not in earthly matters. So the question is, how could you be mamshech elokus through mitzvahs maisis? Okay, that was till the parentheses. So now it's a little more broader, that the verse is coming to tell us, no, that b'shamayim and mal, both in the spiritual and in the material, they're both equal from the perspective of God. Not one is closer to him than the other. That's the pasuk saying b'shamayim and mal ra'os mitachas. In the parentheses, he concerns himself with the question that why exactly would the nations, it says Loma Yim Hagoyim, why do they say that? Why do they separate between the two? Because he explains, because apiseichel, that's what makes sense. Apiseichel, Gashmius and Ruchnis are not the same level. Gashmius is definitely, even according to Torah, it's more concealed, the divine, than the spiritual. The spiritual is aware and has bittul. Gashmius doesn't. So therefore, if you go purely with seichel, with logic, it would seem that if you're more spiritual, you're seemingly closer to God than if you're materialistic. Or let me put it this way, that a spiritual activity is closer to God than a material activity, doing a mitzvah, a Gashmius mitzvah. However, that's only when you go with seichel. When you go l'mayla meseichel, l'mayla tam v'das, which is a munna, which is based on understanding and relating to having a sense, not understanding, relating to atzmos. There you come to relate that Ruchnis and Gashmius Hashavim are equal. Shemayim and Mal Aretz Mitachas are equal. That's the gist of the parentheses. But now I'll break it down. So he says that even Chassidus Umas Elam, to say, for example, those that argue that Ozav Hashem, that God left this earth, that is not Chassidus Umas Elam. Chassidus Umas Elam, the righteous Gentile, believes that God is part of our lives and follows the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide laws, which is on earth, to live a moral, ethical life based on what God wants. So the kfira that he's talking, the minim that separate the two, that we've already negated. But now we're going deeper. We're speaking about spiritual and physical. Are they equal in the eyes of God, so to speak? Can they both access equally godliness? In the sense that, so if you go with seichel, even Chassidus Umas Elam, who do have masigim k'tzaz gili, b'chinas ayin ubit layesh, they do appreciate and comprehend. It says k'tzaz, gilui, of the ayin, meaning the ayin of the yesh hanivra and the bit layesh. So we're not talking about Ozav Hashem. We're not talking about that they say God is not here, he's only in heaven. They do relate to it. Nevertheless, it's still only in Aveda Ruchnis. Why? Because they go achra seichel. And when you go by seichel, machalkim ben Ruchnis legashmis. I'm going over the parentheses, but just the key lines. We don't have to read the whole thing again. So now comes the question, why don't they appreciate more than seichel? So he says, because only Neshamas Yisrael have the Ma'ila Seichel, which is the inyan of munna pshuta, in the Savis Yeshma'ayin and Achdus Hashem, which doesn't require any proof and any sign and any type of indication, doesn't need anything to prove it. It's because that Etzem HaNeshama, Mazle Chazi, meaning the source, the root of the soul, sees and recognizes this as a matter of fact, not as a matter of logic and calculation and empirical proofs. And then he goes on, because neshama, the way it's lamaila, it sees this, it perceives it as if you see it with your own eyes. When you see something with your own eyes, you don't need proof. Because it's like being a witness, you see it directly. So that's what the neshama in its root sees. And from there, it evolves, and when the neshama comes into the body, he uses the word misneitzes, like a spark that shoots off from the root fire, flame, which is the root of the soul, in the guf, and that's a munna. So lamaila, it's riyah, not ba'asaga levad, meaning in the root of the soul, it perceives it like you see it, not with understanding alone. And that comes into the neshama beguf, which is called a munna, that's lamaila metam vadas. In other words, if the neshama understood it and didn't see it in its root, then it wouldn't be able to, then it would come down also in a form of some comprehension, which would make it seichel again. He wants to show that the sheresh neshama is drawn down into the neshama beguf, the soul in the body, and that translates into a munna, which is beyond super rational, and hence the neshama Yisrael can relate to the idea that b'shamayim memal v'aretz mitochas equal ruchnis and Gashmius. And now he said, but this is only by neshama Yisrael, mashenkin b'umas elam, but not by the nations of the world. Even though they also have an Eitzah and Neshamas, they also have a root, their soul also has a root. They come from somewhere. There's an Eitzah and Neshamas, like the Gemara says. The Gemara in Aveda Zara, though the Rebbe Rashab tzeichens to Nida. Nevertheless, by them is not Shaykh Mazlayo Chazi. What he means is, by them is not Shaykh this idea. So they have a Neshama, yes, but you could tie it two ways. You could say that Neshama remains somewhat apart from what comes down to the body by a non-Jew. So they don't have Mazlayo Chazi, the idea that their root sees it and comes down. I don't think that's the meaning, but more b'pashtus, what it means is they don't have that riyah of the Sheresh HaNeshama, which sees directly. The fact that they have a Neshama in spiritual levels, no problem. That's beferish. Absolutely, they do have a soul. But that soul does not perceive, like the Neshama Yisrael, the idea, the yesh ma'ayin, and everything is botl miyuchad be'erein sof. The only thing it does perceive is al pi seichel. Al pi seichel, k'tzaz gilui, in the idea of the ayin of the yesh and bitla hayesh, as he said before. So they don't have mazlaya chazi, and they also don't have the amunah that comes from the mazlaya chazi by the neshama of neshesh neshama. V'chein inyan amunah, that's due to the etzem neshama, also is only shaykh, only applies to neshama Yisrael. That's the elikus, the divinity in the souls, in souls. Then he adds one more thing, that not only is there a munna, but once there is a munna that's rooted in a riyah, in a perception that's super rational in elikus, that also affects seichel. Now he's going to say it also affects seichel. So he says, the l'mayla maseichel v'yadu, the l'mayla maseichel pil gam b'seichel. The idea sheyesh ha'hergish shel l'mayla maseichel, that due to the fact, as a result of the fact, that there's a hergish, that neshama has a sense that's super rational. That causes that also the seichel, that when we contemplate on the divine, now with seichel, it's also infused by and informed by that hergish. Because since you saw something, in other words, I mentioned the example, just give another example. Someone sees a beautiful piece of art. Another person hasn't seen it, but you tell them about it. So they can understand it. They can get a picture of it, but they haven't seen it directly. Someone who's seen it and you explain and then tries to understand the art is going to understand it differently than someone who's never seen it. So both can understand it. Both can understand an idea, but one who's seen it with their own eyes will understand it with a different dimension. So even seichel is affected. In other words, it's not just that one has a munna and the other one doesn't. The munna and the lamayla metam v'das of that hakora, of that vayadaita hagosha that we talked about, that informs and makes the seichel also, the words it says in Yiddish, to really drive the point, the lake from seichel is be'efanacher. The way it resonates is very different. You could almost say it's like the difference between das and chachma and bina, perhaps. Chachma and bina, everybody could understand, and let's say a divine idea. You could understand atzilus. You could understand even levels of ruchnis and Gashmius. But das is when it's personalized and becomes intimate and internalized. That means it means me. It's my father, if you remember the example I gave. So you can say that even the great souls of the nations of the world can definitely appreciate the divine. and learn about it and understand it very deeply. The Rebbe brings from Torah 8 in that footnote, the footnotes on page 230 in volume 13 in Likutei Sichos, which I'm going to elaborate about in a moment more. That says in Torah that they were Chachmei Umas Elam, who spent their whole day, all the time, immersed in ideas, in knowledge, in knowing God. That's absolutely possible. Listen, we say, when Mashiach comes, Lo yeh eser kol ha'elam el ladasas Hashem b'lvad. The whole world will be busy with knowing God. Mala aretz deis Hashem kamayim liyamachas. They will know God, the knowledge of God will fill the whole world. But yet, you can say the differences, like he says there, the Rambam too, and Yisrael will be chachamim v'nevenim. In other words, there's two ways you can understand something. You can understand it with your mind and understand it deeply. If you remember, we learned the Bina has a very profound understanding. You really understand it. But is it mine? Does it belong to you in a sense? Is it so internalized as if this is my Father? Not just you're learning about the Father. It's, I know the artist personally. You know, there was, I think I mentioned it, Rabbi Saul Gordon, Chassid, in the early 40s. So there was discussions here in the Board of Education. The Al Friedrich Rebbe was very insistent that two things should change. That the teachers in the Hebrew school should all be Shomer Shabbos. And the second thing is that the Hebrew studies should be in the beginning of the day to show its primacy. So it shouldn't be like it was being studied. First you studied the secular, and then in the afternoon they studied the Torah. So Friedrich Rebbe wanted Torah to be in the beginning. So when they were sitting with the Board of Education discussing it, the different things, so someone said, why are you so, he asked the Chassidim there, why are you so adamant? First of all, learning Torah altogether. And secondly, that it should be the first thing in the day. So someone answered, because we're in love with the author, or we're in love with the book. I think with the author. I think we're in love with the author. And they immediately got it. You know, you're not going to find anywhere, even the greatest scholars of literature, Shakespearean professors, you're never going to see that they dance a certain day in the year with works of Shakespeare. There's no Simchas Torah by them. You don't see anyone kissing a book. You don't see anyone seeing it as a sacred thing that if it wears out, you don't throw it out, you bury it, just like you would a human being, a life. The concept of Chayenu ve'erech Yameinu, that Torah is our life and our sustenance, our oxygen, not just wisdom, even brilliant wisdom. That is a very unique experience. That means you feel it's yours. It's my family. I love the author. I connect with him personally. That doesn't negate the fact that you could have a deep understanding of Torah. So what he's saying is here, that the neshamas have that personal connection, which is innate. That's not based on seichel. They love the author. Maybe they're the son of the author. Bonim atem l'Hashem elokeichem. And that in turn will make that when they learn it with seichel, they'll also learn it with a different level. Because when you learn something that belongs to you, it's yours because you inherit it as an heir to your parent, a directly connection. Then when you learn it, you also learn it, what he says, with a different leg, with a different resonance, with a different dimension. That again does not mean the other individual cannot understand it well and can have a good discussion with you. But there's some qualitative shift that happens, even in seichel. Then he says, when you don't have that dimension, that supra-rational connection, rak seichel levad, only seichel alone, einem musig. I'm sorry, I skipped something. Einem musig, eich shegashmis kamei haruchnis. Then you won't appreciate, you won't understand how Gashmius is just the same thing as Ruchnius. Going back to the initial theme, Shamayim Mimal v'Aretz Mitochas. V'alkein u'misa'elam, that's why, now he concludes the parentheses, nations of the world which go after Seichel, they distinguish between Ruchnius and Gashmius, Shamayim Mimal v'Aretz Mitochas. Even u'misa'elam that do understand that the divine is in existence. But there's still some distinction between spirit and matter. Now, yesterday I said I would elaborate a bit, which I already did, in explaining this. The fact is, you do find nations, you do find non-Jews that can fully understand what we're learning right now. There may be even some right now in this shiur, in this class, listening in, and part of this. So I want to explain what that means, what he means here. So firstly, I just explained there's the element of the Jews receiving the Torah and having that personal connection. Now, the question you can ask is, can a non-Jew reach that level? So number one, you can definitely say that what he's discussing here is how souls are on their own. There's no question. First of all, besides the concept of a convert, which would mean, but there you could argue that the neshama was originally a Jewish soul, but it got hijacked or got the wires got crossed. But you see that we don't advocate conversion. Why? Because a non-Jew can reach the highest levels of the divine, whatever he relates to, he or she relates to. So the first point I want to make is the following, a very critical point. And when you talk about these things, you may see sometimes a Jew that may not understand Gashmius and Ruchnis as one, and a non-Jew who does understand it. So how does it stem with what it says here? Because he's not talking about an individual where they are. He's talking about an archetype. The archetype of a Neshama Yisrael is one that has a direct connection and therefore is capable of such a hasaga and has that type of a munna. Practically speaking, unfortunately, things can get concealed. That doesn't mean that the Jew who doesn't relate to this cannot arrive at that, but he's going to need to work. He's going to need to learn. He's going to need to reveal his munna. Then you could say it's there. As far as a non-Jew goes, he may not have that initial connection, but he can work on reaching very high levels and appreciating this. That's one point I want to make. The second point is this change in history, in time. The fact of the matter is, the way we believe, the way the Torah explains things, in the beginning of creation, the world was not refined yet. That's why you, in general, till 26 generations after creation, there was no such thing as Torah on earth. There was spiritual. The Ovis fulfilled it, as we said yesterday, in a spiritual way. But the giving of Torah that happened at Sinai happened in the year 2448. That's almost, it's almost half the, not half, but a little like a third of creation. Because remember, 6,000 years, Shit al V'shin Hava Alma. So the first 2,000, and basically first 2,500 years, 2448 exact, to be exact, there was no concept of Torah and Yisrael. That whole thing happened 2,448 years after creation. So what does that tell you? That the world initially was a material world, and you didn't yet have the concept, even though Bereishis b'shul Torah b'shul Yisrael, that's the purpose, but it didn't happen yet on earth. So though Adam was, of course, a very great soul, he was with the highest soul of all, because he is the source of all souls. Yitzir Kapav Shal Kodesh Baruch Hu, he was shaped and created by God himself. The only human being, him and Chava, that did not have parents, so their lineage is directly to God. And yet, still, on a physical level, it did not permeate. That's why he was able to do the Chet Sadas. So it didn't permeate the physical. His soul was a very high level. And it took 26 generations, or 2,448 years, for Adam and then Noach, and of course, in between all the destruction, the Mabul and so on, until Avram came and began reversing the process and starting to bring the Shekhinah back to earth. To the point that 7 generations after Avram would be Moshe Rabbeinu, and that would finally bring the Shis Mitzrayim, Matan Torah, and the building of the Mishkan. That's the first time you have the concept that material and spiritual are one. As a matter of fact, as the Rebbe cites so often, Matan Torah, till Matan Torah, there was Gzeira. What was Gzeira? El Yenim la Yardu Lamata. That which was above, the spiritual, did not come down into the material. V'tachtenim la Yala Lamayla. And the material couldn't go up to the spiritual. Basically, Shamayim and Mala, Aretz Metachas, were split. Not because there was no God on earth, but it was not yet Nimshach. Through Aveda, there was still that two type of domains, two entities. By Matan Torah, what do we say? Vayered Hashem al Har Sinai. Vel Moshe Amar Alei El Ahar. that we had now the first fusion where the divine, heaven and earth came and joined. And from the Matan Torah on, we're told, we now have the power to fuse and integrate matter and spirit, to take a mitzvah maisi, and a physical mitzvah, and it can connect all the way to the highest levels. That did not happen before Matan Torah, except, as I mentioned, bris. That was one mitzvah the Eibishter gave Avram Avinu, that brisi b'psarchem, take your flesh and circumcise, and you have a covenant with me of flesh, but only bris. That's why the Rebbe always brings that when he sent Elazar to go find a shidduch for Yitzchak, he says, Simna yotcha tachas yirechi. Place your arm. He wanted him to give him a vow, an oath. An oath, you need to have nikitas chayfetz. You have to hold something when you give an oath. It has to be manifest in a physical way. So the din is that you have to hold something. So he told him to put his arm, his hand, under his ribs, which means to touch the bris, which of course is not a tzniusdik thing to do. So the Rebbe explains that I could show you this. The commentaries explain. The Rebbe brings it off, and because that was the only thing that was a chefzer shel kedusha. There was nothing else on earth. There was no sefer Torah. There was no mezuzah. There was no tefillin. There was no physical thing that you could hold on to that was a dover kodesh. That was the only thing, because bris was the only mitzvah. But getting back to our point, so Matan Torah actually then solidified the idea of b'shamayim v'mal v'oretz mitachas. Again, this doesn't mean that before Matan Torah wasn't the reality, like the minim say. But there was a schism, there was a split. So what do you see from this? What's my whole point with this? You see that there's a process in history. Even it didn't begin Torah and Neshamas Yisrael and that's it. It took years, it took thousands of years for that to become a reality on earth. And then even after Matan Torah, the Geula didn't come. Then began a new stage of hard work. Even though Matan Torah fused the two, the Alter Rebbe says in chapter 36 in Tanya, that Matan Torah was a me'einzeh. It was a taste. It was like a glimpse of what would be when Mashiach comes. Then comes the Aveda that we've been doing from 2448 till 5781. We're talking about over 3,300 years that we've been doing Aveda, first in the Midbar of the Eden, then in Eretz Yisrael, then Bayis Rishon, and Bayis Sheni, the first temple, the second temple, and then Golus Edom, almost 2,000 years since the destruction of the second temple. And what is the work that we've been doing? In one broad stroke, we've been refining the physical world and making it a keli for Ruchnis, to demonstrate that Gashmius and Ruchnis are one. So the millions and billions of mitzvahs that have been done since Matan Torah have changed, refined the world. So it shouldn't be a surprise. Part of the world are the nations of the world. So it's no surprise that the nations of the world would appreciate deeper things that they would not have appreciated thousands of years ago. One of the reasons, why did the Eibishter come and offer the Torah to Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esav? The Gemara, the Medrash says that first he came to the children of Yishmael, and they said, then offered them the Torah. They looked into the Torah, it said certain things, they said, no, we don't accept. We can't deal with that. We can't accept that. Bnei Esav, some say leisachmeid, leisirtzach, leisignev. Those laws disturbed them. There's different girsayos, which one they didn't like, which one they didn't like, which one they felt they could not adhere to. Then the same thing with Bnei Esav. He offered it to the children of Esav. And they also rejected it. Then he came to the Eden, and they said Nasa v'nishma. They didn't even ask to look into it. They took it and that's received it. So if the question is asked, of course, why did the Eibishter offer it to them? What would have happened if they said yes? What would the Eibishter do to the Jews? Say, hey, okay, sorry guys, you just spent 210 years in a bitter exile. You're the children of Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and you were paid many prices. But you know what? I have another customer. What would have happened exactly? So what Eibishter was playing a game. He knew that they wouldn't receive it. So why did he ask them then? And interestingly, it says Yishmael and Esav. What about the other nations? So firstly, it's answered that all the nations are encompassed in those two. But above all, remember, Esav is the son of Yitzchak. Yishmael is the son of Avram. They're also Bnei Avram and Bnei Yitzchak. So the Eibishter was saying there's different reasons given. One reason, the Zohar says, Chassidus brings it, the Tzemach Tzedek, because he was preparing them. He didn't ask it as a knowing they would reject it. Yes, he knew they would reject it, but by asking them, he was preparing them for the day that they will accept it. And preparing them for the Oz Epech El Amim Sofa Brura, that when Mashiach comes, all the nations will accept God. What is Sheva Mitzvah B'nei Neach? It includes Leis Signev, Leis Sirtzach, and Leis Sechmed. No, not Leis Sechmed, not those words, but the idea of not stealing, of not murdering, and not coveting, sexual propriety, etc. All the laws of Sheva Mitzvah B'nei Neach. So the Eibishter prepared the ground by asking them. Some say, I don't know who the some is, but I often explain that when the Christianity was born, the Rambam says that Christianity and Islam, despite all their flaws, the fact is that divine providence, they help bring the message of unity and Mashiach to the whole world, even to the farthest islands. That's what the Rambam says in Hilchos Malachim, chapter 11. It was taken out from later editions by the censors, but we have today the original. Why? Because ultimately, when they embraced in some way, even if it's not complete, the Sheva mitzvahs, the laws of mitzvahs, which was given at Sinai, so basically the fulfillment was that Esau, the children of Esau, which are the Christian Western Roman world, Bnei Edom, ultimately did accept the Torah in their area that belongs to them. And Yishmael, a few centuries later, with the birth of Islam, which is actually, from the Rambam's point of view, monotheism, meaning it's not a Veda Zara, that some would say Christianity is shituf, is even more aligned, also embraced it. So suddenly Bnei Yishmael and Bnei Esau that rejected something thousands of years earlier, now, or a little more than 1,000 years earlier, now embraced it, and preparing the ground that the entire world, including Ummah Sa'elam, all the nations will accept the idea of what? That God runs the world. So you can say that even though the Rebbe Rashab is stating this as a fact from the Siddur and other places, that there is a difference, but you can definitely say that the world has changed, and meaning that the non-Jewish world is far closer now to understanding divine unity, even on the level of Shamayim Emal Va'aretz Mitachas. And it's not a contradiction to this, because he's explaining the Etzem Inyan of their level. But through the generations, refinement has happened. Still, one most important point I want to conclude, that still does not mean there isn't a difference between a Jewish soul and a non-Jewish soul. And the difference is not a matter of inferiority or superiority, but like I explained, I believe in a previous class, if not, I'll say it now, that the real point is that they have different roles. The role of the Jew is to introduce Sevav Kalalman, is to introduce L'mayla Ma'aseichel. The fact that non-Jews have embraced that as well, and there are many that have, is all part of that process. The primary role of the nations of the world is to reveal the divine within existence. Knows the Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra. It is the Jew that introduces also the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti. That doesn't mean there is an overlap. Just like a munna informs seichel, like we just learned, the same thing, seichel can also relate to a munna. There are many non-Jews that have faith. They have a munna. I mean, the Rebbe speaks, in God we trust. We know there's my minim. The Baal Shem Tov would not want to ride in a wagon with a Christian who did not cross himself. So the idea of Amunah exists. The only thing is the primary difference is the Amunah one that relates more to existence, and therefore Ruchnis and Gashmius have some distinction? Or is it Amunah that is completely Lamaila, higher than existence, like almost a Das Elyon Amunah, that the higher level of Das Elyon, which is the connection of the Neshama to its source, and there is no difference between Gashmius and Ruchnis, b'Shamayim Mimol, Aretz Mitachas. So when you look at the letter that the Rebbe wrote in volume 13, Likutei Sichos, page 230, he cites clearly from the Rambam, the end of Hilchos Shmita V'Yevel, Loi Shevet Levi Bolvad, not just Shevet Levi alone, but Kol Ish V'ish, every person. And the Rebbe says clearly it means nations of the world included. If they separate themselves from the nonsense of this world and the pettiness, and they connect themselves to God, they become sanctified in the Holy of Holies. So you see from that, that's a pretty high level, Holy of Holies. That still doesn't mean there isn't a distinction. But if you look in all those footnotes, then, and take this together with what we just learned, this parentheses, you come away with a very broader picture of what exactly is the Jewish soul, the non-Jewish soul, each of their roles, and each one has a value that they have to accomplish, and that's their role. It's not a matter of a competition or a popularity contest of who is greater and who is lower. That's not the point here. The point is different roles in doing a job. It's like saying the Kohanim go into the Beis Hamikdash, the Leviim also. Yisraelim can't. Does that make a Yisrael inferior? No, you have a different job. Zvulun's job is to do business l'shem shamayim. Yisachar's job is to be the teachers and the educators. The fact that there's diversity and different roles does not define superiority or inferiority. It's different roles in bringing godliness in this world. And in that context, you can explain this, and I would have no problem explaining this piece to Jews or non-Jews, and it's not a matter of discrimination. It's a matter of understanding on a deeper level what different roles are, and including the overlap and including some of the other details that I explained. So here you have, some of you have been vying for me to talk about the non-Jew and the Jew. So here, because the Mimer talks about it, then fits into Ayin Beis. So I gave some elaboration. But, I'll stop now. If anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to take them, and then we'll continue. I hope that was helpful.
This is a very revolutionary explanation. It's fascinating, very interesting, but no buts. Very interesting.
That's why I say I'm basing this not on my theories. I'm basing it on the Rebbe's letter. I'm basing it on many of the Rebbe's sikhs. I'm also basing it on the fact is the world does change. We did refine the world. The world includes Umas Elam. The Umas Elam are not the raw pagan of Evdei Avodah Zarah of the time of Avram Avinu. If we say that, then the world hasn't changed. Then nothing was accomplished.
Could we apply the concept of Sadiq and Russia, like it says in Tanya, by a guy? If a guy follows his nefesh Bahamis and doesn't do the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, he's a Rasha and Neshalish Klippus Atmeis. But if he follows his, so to speak, neshama, whatever, I guess some places that spark, or his Aitzer neshama is from Guf, he's a tzaddik, and that is.
I have not seen anywhere a source to use the word tzaddik b'nei Russia on a non-Jew. So I can't say that those levels, tzaddik is someone that has no Yetzer Hara altogether. Even a Jew can't reach the level of a tzaddik that the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya. So why would you say a goy does? Even a Jew, unless there's Yarav Alav Ruach Memorim and the Eibishter sends him a ibur of a tzaddik, the highest a human being most of us can reach is a Beinani. And so I'm not sure why you would suddenly talk about tzaddik by anybody, not just for non-Jews. So I've not seen it, but I will say this is in a subtle way. Yes, you could say that when a non-Jew follows the Ruach HaBehema Yoredes Lamata in the Pasuk in Kehelis, the spirit of the animal, and does not follow Sheva Mitzvahs, he would be the equivalent of a Rasha, if you wish. And if he does control himself and does follow the Sheva Mitzvahs, you could say, on his level, not compared to Jews now, in his own level, that would be like a Beinani. But I've not seen that anywhere explicit. And but you could extrapolate, and derive that. That's what. But there's other words for it in Torah. It's the difference between Chasidu U'Mese'elam and not Chasidu U'Mese'elam. Chasidu U'Mese'elam is the word that the Torah would use for a non-Jew who follows the Sheva Mitzvahs. Yesh le chelik be'elam haba. And he has a part in the Elam Haba, means his nefesh, his neshama, Eitzar neshamas, has come alive and expressed itself, and he has earned Kedush Kadashim, the Rambam says in Hilchah Filchus Shmita V'Yevel, and all the different qualities. If you look again in Likutei Sichos, volume 13, page 230, I'll repeat it as many times as I need to until you learn every footnote there in detail, and you'll understand the picture much better than what I'm even saying right here. So I wouldn't use the word Sadiq Rasha Beinani because that is perhaps exclusive. I would definitely use the word Chasidu U'Mese'elam and not Chasidu U'Mese'elam, which is the real halachic and direct description for it, which is a great level to reach.
Can I ask a quick question, Rabbi?
Of course, we're all asking questions here. Go ahead.
Thank you. So, first of all, you answered a large part of my question from yesterday, and the refinement you gave today already took me very far into answering the question, but I'm still having a hard time understanding or reconciling everything you just said with a clause here in the Ayin Beis, in the fourth line from the bottom, and it says, "Umos ha'olam shaholchim rak acher hasechel." It says they're only following their mental capacity, their understanding, their hasaga, and nothing beyond that. But this is the early 20th century. This is not 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. This is fairly recent, and we know that, as you said, there can be the righteous of the world, righteous Goyim, and they can comprehend the idea that faith is beyond reason. So I'm having a hard time understanding how, on the one hand, it says sheholchim rak acher hasechel, but yet there are the righteous Goyim that can understand the idea that faith is beyond reason, and that they have a very deep faith. And faith is faith. If they understand that faith is beyond reason, and we can agree they have it, and they could, I don't understand how you can reconcile those two concepts.
So I have to say, with all respect, you probably didn't hear everything I said, because I addressed that very directly. So I'll address it again in case you or others didn't fully get it. So let me address it. And it's always best to answer a question with a question. Let's make the question even stronger. In the end of chapter 1 in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe says that that Goyim, the nations of the world, come from Shalosh Klippos Hatmeis. That's even more than saying that they only go by Seichel. Shalosh Klippos Hatmeis shekulei ra ve'ein behem teiv klal. They have no good at all. And even the good they do, it says, chesed lo min chatos, that the kindness of the nations is a sin, because they're doing it for their own intentions, their own agenda. So how could we say that there's a chesidu Maseilim altogether? How could we say that the world is ready for Mashiach? If there's shalosh klippos hatmeis, we're talking about almost 8 billion people on earth. The Jews are only 14 million, and the Jews also are hardly perfect. So what does it mean? So the answer is the same answer what I said earlier, both in the Maimer and in Tanya. The Alter Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab are not talking, it's not headlines in the newspaper of their time. They're talking the level of Goyishkeit. Remember I said in the beginning of creation, the whole world was an unrefined place. There's the concept of a Goy, not the individual, but the concept of, what does a Goy mean? A nation of the world. The world on its own, without any refinement or work, is a place of total concealment. It is the role of the human being, starting with Adam Harishon, to come to bring the divine into existence, to reveal godliness in existence. For 2,448 years, there was no such thing as the concept of a Jew or a non-Jew or even Torah in the formal sense of the word. There were people working toward that. There were people who were embracing God, embracing God's laws, but it was not yet formalized till Matan Torah. Thousands of years more have passed. So if you're talking about the level of a non-Jew, as I said, there could be even a Jew that's on the level of a non-Jew, practically speaking. As I said, I know Jews that claim they have no faith, and I know non-Jews that claim they do have faith, and they live by that. So you're not talking about individuals, you're talking about the archetype, as I put it. These are archetypes. That's the archetype. Now, does it apply practically? You could say that the non-Jew archetype is primarily seichel. Or you could say, what does seichel mean? Their role is to bring godliness in the world of seichel. That's why you say, chochma bagoyim tamin. They have chochma, and they could have divine wisdom as well, like he says here. I was explaining that through Avodah, just as Jews have grown, just as the world has become refined, nations have also become refined. That's why it's not a contradiction. That's why the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Hillel, writes that the Alter Rebbe said that what he says at the end of Perek Aleph of Tanya is only referring to non-chesidu Maseilim. He's referring to the way they are on their own. But Chassidus Umas Elam, he says, comes from Klippas Nega. Klippas Nega is a whole different reality. And the words Ein Be'em Tev Klal, the Tzemach Tzedek adds, Mitzad Atzmam. They don't have good on at all on their own, meaning leaving them alone without any aveda, without any refinement. But once you bring the refinement into the picture, then that's how I explained how they can have a munna. You see they have a munna. They're non-Jews that have complete faith, real faith. You can't deny that. So the Rebbe Rashab can't be saying something that contradicts the Metzius. He was talking either the archetype or the most of the non-Jews in the world perhaps were on that level at some point. That's how I explained this before. So it's not a contradiction. And the fact of the matter is that they can have a munna in Mamal Kalalmin and the higher levels as well. It all comes down to how you explain it and what level you explain it. But generally speaking, as I said, each of them have a primary role. That leads me to the last point I made, that the primary role of Umas Elam is to refine the world with the divine within existence, which is Seichel. And the primary role, and a non-Jew, and a neshama, a Jew introduces levels that are beyond Seichel. But that doesn't mean there isn't overlap, and doesn't mean that there hasn't been change, because the fact of the matter is that even the Rambam's language in Sof Perek Ches, the end of chapter 8 in Hilchos Malachim, what does he say? That teach the non-Jews about the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Neach, but also that it was given at Sinai. Sinai is l'mayla miseichel. Not just that they're Sheva mitzvahs, he says, not just doing it mitzad hechra hadas. They shouldn't just do it mitzad logic. They should do it because God commanded it. So right there you have something which shows that they have something that's beyond just rational laws.
Thank you. Shkoyach.
I think they also might be believing in that they have one element of a munna. They have a munna in the seichel, and they don't have quite the flash munna of the Jewish people. It's a different. They can have a munna in seichel. That's it, baby.
Look, there's nothing wrong to say that the Jewish people throughout history were the bearers of the flame, the carriers of the flame, and were witnesses. I mean, the Christian world and the Muslim world, when you talk to them normally without any anti-Semitism or hatred, will always say, you are the ones that brought this message first to the world. Remember, at the end of the day, Yoshka is a Jew, a frum Jew at that. And basically, in other words, that the Jewish people actually witnessed Sinai. The Gemara says the whole world was stilled. They came running to Bilam. What's going on? And he said, Hashem eiz la'amayit and Hashem yivarach hasamei b'shalom. In other words, the whole world sensed and knew that the Jewish people were the witnesses. Like he says here, Riyah. And it's not a matter of pulling rank. I think it's vital to emphasize. This isn't about superiority. That's not the key. The key is about responsibility. If you're a witness to an event that changed the world, and then you bear witness and you share it with the rest of the world, what they call the Jews as the people of the book, and you read this again and again, and it's with humility, not with anyone claiming superiority or privilege and so on, then there's nothing wrong with saying that neshamas do have an experience of riyah, which they shared, not just with others, but also with the non-Jewish world, and that changed the world, and it's continuing to change the world. The Rebbe's approach to the founding fathers, to the United States of America, is that they were divinely inspired to create this country with the rules and laws that follow more or less the foundations of the 10 Commandments and the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nei Neach. Let's not forget that. The problem is, and this is where I just will say this, I grew up also in a certain environment. We were trained, I would say even programmed to think a certain way about this, that is difficult to get beyond. So we have a lot of prejudices and many of our own, I would even call distorted views on this matter. That's why I'm quoting everything from sources. Like if you learn this parentheses alone, you'd come away with a very different picture. You'd come away that Jews are superior and they have munna, non-Jews don't, and so on. That's why I'm quoting so many other sources, because there's a bigger picture here than meets the eye.
Does this explain a concept we learn a lot in Chassidus, that Hashem is not Gashmius and not Ruchnius?
It's partially, yeah, the idea that once you get to understanding Elikus, Atzmus, not in terms of Hasoge. Remember, Das Tachten and Das Elyon that we learned before, the first two levels were through Hasoge. You come to understand it. You come to understand even Lamayla Metam V'das, Ru'usa Deliba. Remember that. But then he says there's the Etzem HaNeshama. That's Lamayla Mahasoge. A Das and Akora, a recognition and a feeling, a resonance, an identification that's not based on Seichel. Back on page 1180, he said this clearly. Akora Vargoshin, the Makif of Yechida. So that comes to appreciate the Etzem, which is where Gashmi and Ruchni become equal.
Did the Goyim have the idea of Das Tachton, a Ayin of the Yesh Nifra?
He said it literally. He said it at the beginning of the parentheses.
Yeah.
He says, "Chetzaz gili b'chinas ha'ayin ubit layesh." Second line of the parentheses.
Okay, that's what that's referring to. In other words, they can have that Das Tachton kind of
I said even Das Elyon, I would explain.
How so? To what extent?
I just spoke for a half hour about it. I'm not going to go.
I heard every word. I have heard every word. I just wanted to tie it into Das Elyon. About the insignificance and about the fact that everything is made from creation.
Yeah, I'm not getting into what level. Listen, among Jews itself, do we have Das Tachton and Das Elyon in the third level? In concept, we have the potential. But, practically, everyone has to work on this. I would say the same thing with the non-Jewish world, depending where they grow and how far they grow. I've met many, many non-Jews that have a very good understanding of Das Elyon and appreciate it and relate to it. And unfortunately, others that don't have that. It all comes down to levels of appreciation. And again, there's archetypes, there's roles, and then there's the practical, meaning when you meet somebody and you see what they have come to, they come to relate to, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, as I mentioned yesterday, Jewish mysticism does focus, mitzvahs maisius you not find in Buddhism or in other mystical teachings, because their spiritual is definitely superior to physical. And as a matter of fact, many think the physical is simply a antechamber, a passageway to the spiritual. In Torah, the Maiso Ikar, that the Dira B'Tachtenim touches Etzem. So there is that unique philosophy that is unique to Judaism. You don't find that so much in other schools of spiritual thinking. I will even say, lahavdil, even in the Jewish community itself, there are many people who think the whole world is only to bring us to the retirement village in Elam Haba, to the spiritual. So even in Jewish Judaism itself, you have different schools of thought. But Chassidus, the Psak Din, and the final say in it all is that this dir b'tachtenim, dafka atzmus and dafka tachtenim, mitzvah maisis reaches the highest levels, where therefore Gashmius and Ruchnius are shavim in that sense. Each one has a mile over the other. In some ways, the Yesh HaNivra comes from the Yesh HaMiti. Even Ruchnius doesn't have that. On the other hand, Ruchnius has the Giluyim of Elikus, as we learned earlier.
It seems like the role of a non-Jew is to be just spiritual, and a Jew, it's not enough to be spiritual. He must have.
No. I would not say that at all. Where do you see he says that here?
Is it safe to summarize
What's
this?
that? Let me just respond to that. He doesn't say that here. He doesn't say that at all. He says that that by Umus Elam, there's a chiluk between Gashmius and Ruchnius. That's what he says.
Is it safe to summarize this? Is it correct to summarize this as saying that a Yid's Avaida is to connect Gashmius and Ruchnius, and a Guy's Avaida is to refine the Gashmius?
I wouldn't say that, because Ayin of Yesh HaNivra and the Bitla Yesh is also refining Gashmius with Elikus. So I wouldn't put it in those words, no. I would say both have a role of bringing Ruchnius into Gashmius and connecting them. The question is which level of Ruchnius and which level, and to the extent of that connection. That's what I would say.
All right.
So what he's saying is spirituality could go without religious.
I didn't say that either. Who's talking about spirituality and religion here?
Religion is the mitzvahs. Spirituality is ruchnis.
What's that? This is an assumption. Christianity is a religion?
What is a religion? Who knows?
Yeah, we just
please.
throw out a word religion. Is Christianity a religion? Is Islam a religion? Das Notzim, das Ishmaelim, das Islam. So you have to define what you mean by religion. You mean by actions?
Action.
They all have actions. Every religion has its rituals. So let's not confuse things here. We got to spell out what we're talking about. Obviously, he's talking here about Yiddishkeit and Torah, mitzvahs maisius. Let's say it's tzitzis, tefillin, mezuzah, tzedakah. Anyway, so I gave the overview. Think about it. Go back to volume 230, volume 13, page 230. I gave enough material here. I don't think you're going to get it all in one shot. It needs some thinking. Think it through, and we can revisit it if you have more questions.
Goyish enlightenment.
You're not going to find the black and white. There's plenty of overlap. Remember, all human beings originate from the same human being called Adam Arishon. And Chaviv Adam Shenivra B'Tselem. You have to keep in mind these things. So there's a lot of similarities, and there's differences as well. But Koyan Levi Yisrael is also differences, right?
Rabbi, have you given a class on this topic where you do a number of shiurim? Because it's clear to me you've given tremendous thought, tremendous research into the sources, how to deal with this issue. It's so important. And
I actually gave, years ago, I did a series of 10 classes on this topic.
Where can we find it?
I'll ask my office to dig it up and post it in some way.
Thank you very much.
Please, Yafi. I would appreciate that also. I would like to do it
for everybody. If I have it, it's available to all of you.
You recently spoke about it on Chassidus Applied, no?
I have, if you look it up there as well. But did anyone look it up and listen?
I listened to you, like 2 weeks ago you had a shiur? It was very good.
And I gave all the cross references to all the times I spoke about it. Look, let's be honest here. You have to do the work yourself. I can't do the heavy lifting for you. I can give you the overview. I can present it. I can explain it. I can answer questions. But I've given you places to look up. If you really want, you're going to have to take the time. You guide to Mitzasi. And listen, I'll bring these 10 classes, fine. But I already gave, like you just said, on my life, I did probably 10 episodes on that. Not entire episodes, but I've done definitely over an hour worth of talking about it. More probably. So they're all referenced. Exactly 2 weeks ago, I spoke about it. And I cross-referenced. I said exactly which episode you can find more about it. So I don't know what more I can do except give you these references. And even if I give you the recordings, you still have to listen to them. Remember. So I'll try to dig it up. We'll try to find it. We have it. We know where it is. I want to just see in what format. I think it's in digital format. And I'll give you links.
I listened to the prior class as well. And you mentioned maybe 10 or 12 different shiurim or prior episodes where you mentioned something about it. I was just, number one, it's nice to see it consolidated in one set of series. And number two, if you hadn't done it yet, I was suggesting it's such important work, it would be good to give such a series.
Okay, look, I'm happy to just take all suggestions, but you have to remember, this goes into like a group of 500 suggestions that I have in my box. So I have to determine in each case what to do, what's a priority and for whom and so on. So whatever I have available, definitely make available. And consolidating, look, if somebody wants to volunteer and take all those pieces from my life and put them together in one big clip, I wouldn't say no.
Maybe you need a sponsor to sponsor the class for you.
Okay, that's also always welcome. If somebody wants to sponsor, or a few people I could then apply somebody and tell them do this job of taking together all the stuff on this and put it into one so-called one one either long class or one section, maybe create a section out of this topic. I'm happy to do it also. But I'm not complaining. I'm just, since you bring it up, I'm just telling you, we are somewhat pretty overwhelmed as it is our team. So some things take more time, some less time.
Shkoyach. I wasn't complaining. I was saying you've given a lot of thought to this. It's important for the Yidden and Goyim to hear this. And there aren't many people that have synthesized everything you said. I haven't heard any, frankly.
I'm happy to do it. Look, I did it now. I've done it over the years. I'm the last guy that is depriving anyone from my teachings.
Chas v'shalom.
So, no, I understand it. It's all in good spirit. Don't worry. I'm not feeling in any way. We're all fine. As I said, I'll get my office to put together, see what we have in our so-called inventory, our warehouse. Try to post it, make it available. But meanwhile, there is the My Life, and you don't have to listen the whole hour. There are timestamps. You can go straight only to that topic.
Thank you, Shkoyach.
Remember, My Life is now over 7 years. I'm starting the 8th year now. So there's almost every topic has been covered to some extent. And they're easy to find if you search by keywords and so on. Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad we went through this. And
so the keyword for that would be Umeis Ha'olam.
Well, I would try to find English words. Nations of the world, non-Jews and Jews. That would be probably more likely. Or Sheva Mitzvahs, because it's in English. Okay, we stop here. We reviewed the parentheses again and the whole issue.